Welcome to Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise, get you straight to the key insights on today's really critical issues. And today, well, we're diving into something that's genuinely redrawing the map of European security. A map, many people thought was pretty much settled. It's not just about battlefields, though. We're talking profound shifts in the digital space, the economy, even, within the fabric of democratic societies themselves.
That's absolutely right. And our mission here in this deep dive is really to help you quickly get a handle on these multifaceted challenges Europe is facing. We've pulled together insights from Defending Europe, other key reports too, just to understand how external aggression, these internal vulnerabilities, and shifting global dynamics, how they're forcing a complete rethink of what security and resilience actually mean today. It's about distilling those interconnected threats, and the urgent strategies being put forward.
Okay, so let's start unpacking that. The shifting geopolitical sands, as you put it.
Yeah.
For years, we sort of assumed the post-Cold War order was, stable. But the sources are pretty stark, aren't they? Russia is now clearly defined as a revanchist power. What does that actually mean, in practical terms for Europe? And why is that label so crucial?
Precisely. A revanchist power. It essentially means a state that's actively trying to reclaim lost territories or influence. It's fundamentally challenging the existing order, the one set up after the Cold War, rather than, say, integrating into it. And we've seen this play out, haven't we? 2008 in Georgia, 2014 with Crimea's annexation, and then, most brutally, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It's not just one thing, it's a pattern, a consistent pattern that really marks Russia as a fundamental threat to security, both European and global.
Right. So we're not just talking conventional military force then. The sources talk about Russia's approach as a hybrid war. Could you break that down? What does that look like beyond, tanks and soldiers?
Absolutely. And hybrid war is, it's fascinating because it's often warfare without firing a shot, not in the traditional sense anyway. It uses everything. Yeah. Aggressive disinformation campaigns, for instance, often working alongside China, aimed at manipulating public opinion, escalating ethnic tensions, eroding trust in democracy. We see this very actively in places like the Western Balkans, Kosovo, where narratives are deliberately shaped and controlled. It's really an attempt to dominate the information battlefield, perhaps before any physical fighting even starts.
And it's not just what you read or hear, is it? What about actual digital disruption? How do Russian cyber units fit into this picture?
Oh, it's a very real, very present threat. Russian cyber units have been, relentlessly targeting critical infrastructure right across Europe. Think financial institutions, airports, banks, government structures, places like the UK, Germany, Denmark. And this isn't new either. It goes back to Estonia in 2007. These attacks, they have a dual purpose. They cause immediate economic disruption, sure, but crucially, they also signal Moscow's capacity for widespread instability. It's a clear warning, a chilling one, without needing direct military action.
And beyond cyber, we're seeing this blatant weaponization of, essential resources.
Yeah.
What are some really striking examples of that, and why does it matter so much?
Well, think about Gazprom deliberately holding back gas supplies from Europe, even when they had plenty. That wasn't just a commercial issue. It was a profound strategic move. It shows how basic things, energy, food, raw materials, can be turned into weapons. It forces a, frankly, painful rethink of Europe's energy security and reveals just how deep that leverage can run. It really exposes vulnerabilities that come from interdependence.
And then there's this wider threat, isn't there, to the global commons, sea, space, air, these areas that we once thought were open, secure. They're increasingly contested by powers like Russia, China, Iran. What stands out in the reports about this contest?
What's really concerning is just how audacious some of these actions are. The Belarus government hijacking a civilian plane, Russia jamming sophisticated rocket systems in Ukraine, China's aggressive claims in the South China Sea, or the Iran-backed Houthi attacks in the Red Sea disrupting shipping. These aren't just isolated incidents. Taken together, they suggest that global interconnectedness, which we often see as a strength, it's also becoming a major vulnerability. These powers are actively showing they're willing to disrupt global norms.
Which definitely raises a big question about the transatlantic relationship. The reports mention ambiguity in the U.S. approach to Europe's defense. They even talk explicitly about a potential second Trump administration. How does that possibility impact Europe's strategic thinking?
It makes the whole discussion about building a strong European pillar within NATO not just, desirable, but absolutely critical for future security. If Europeans might potentially be left on their own, as the reports put it, then the need for Europe to develop its own robust defense capabilities still rooted in NATO, mind you, becomes urgent. It's about self-reliance within the alliance structure.
Okay, so with all these external pressures mounting, the big question for Europe is, how do we actually defend ourselves? Let's look at the structures we already have. NATO, for instance, still central,
Yeah.
right? Lord Ismay's famous line, keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. It's still the bedrock.
It absolutely is. NATO remains the ultimate collective defense guarantee for its members, no question. But what's evolving now is this debate around the European pillar within NATO. There's this distinction you see between a narrow view, Europeans acting basically as a caucus inside NATO, and a broad one, where European defense efforts, often led by the EU, are very closely linked with NATO, and the EU's push for strategic sovereignty, which is kind of a deeper idea of political authority, not just autonomy. That's key here, balancing its own capabilities with NATO's established primary role.
And that push for stronger defense, it's clearly gaining speed. It is encouraging, isn't it, that the number of NATO members hitting that 2% GDP defense spending target is up to 11 now. But the analysis suggests Europe needs to go further, maybe aiming for 3.5% minimum. It's not just hitting a number, though, is it? It's about real capability. And we have a new EU commissioner for defense cooperation now, which feels like a serious institutional shift.
You're absolutely right. The raw numbers are stark. But yeah, beyond just meeting targets, this idea of a European single defense market is seen as crucial for reducing costs, enhancing capabilities. Projects like the Eurodrome, they show successful collaboration is possible. On paper, it promises big savings, better kit, right? But what's the catch? Because there's always a catch.
Well, yeah, that immediately brings up a dilemma, doesn't it? How do you balance that cost reduction and efficiency with, well, national sovereign control, especially when countries want to protect their own defense industries?
Exactly. You have national provisions like Article 346 in the treaty, which basically acts as a safeguard. It lets member states protect their essential security interests, especially around arms production. This means truly binding deep immigration measures. They're incredibly difficult to push through.
Which leads straight to the Buy European debate. Now, on the surface, that sounds protectionist, maybe even clashes with liberal free trade ideas. But the reports argue it's vital for strategic sovereignty. Why is this seemingly protectionist idea now seen as essential for security?
Well, it's a pragmatic view, really. It prioritizes security and self-reliance. It's about ensuring Europe controls its own defense industrial base rather than being overly reliant on outside suppliers. Especially, given the geopolitical shifts we were just talking about, it's viewed as a strategic imperative now, building resilience, making sure Europe isn't caught short in a crisis because it depends on others for critical defense stuff.
And the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's provided some incredibly stark lessons. Beyond the actual fighting, what practical insights have these capability coalitions like the Ramstein format or the specific coalitions for artillery, drones, armor? What have they shown us about future EU and NATO cooperation?
Well, they've shown a clear path for more agile cooperation based on specific needs. That's positive. But they've also highlighted a really sobering reality. Russia's estimated monthly artillery shell production, maybe 250,000, that significantly outpaces the EU's target for 2026, which is around 167,000, and the U.S. target for 2025, about 100,000. This significant advantage on the battlefield, as the reports call it, just underscores how urgently European defense industrial capacity needs scaling up. Dramatically, it's a stark reminder. Intent is one thing, actual industrial output is another.
Okay, let's pivot now to Europe's inner core.
Yeah.
Safeguarding democracy, the rule of law. It's a critical point in the sources, isn't it? That Europe's security is being reshaped, not just from outside, but also from within. They highlight democratic decline, the rise of illiberal tendencies. Can you define this term, strategic corruption? How does that tie into this internal erosion?
Yeah, strategic corruption. It's where hostile, undemocratic regimes use financial dependence, essentially, to distort how government officials behave, to advance their own interests. It's a kind of quiet infiltration. The Quadargate scandal, for example, involved allegations of foreign influence cash for favors right at the European Parliament, involving MEP Eva Kaili, and similarly, allegations against Maximilian Krah related to China. They show how this can play out, exposing vulnerabilities right at the top of European institutions. It's fundamentally about undermining trust and integrity from the inside.
And we're seeing these foreign agent laws popping up in places like Georgia, Serbia, laws that are eerily similar to Russia's own restrictions. What's the real impact of laws like these?
Well, they're designed quite clearly to delegitimize and restrict NGOs, to undermine civil society. They effectively silence independent voices, often under the banner of national security. It's a worrying trend, mirroring autocratic tactics, and it makes it much harder for civil society to hold governments accountable. It erodes democratic oversight.
The populist playbook also feeds into this internal erosion, doesn't it? Populist parties, both right and left, while maybe not always openly pro-Russian, they seem to play a role.
Yep.
How do the sources describe their impact?
Well, they often appeal with simplified, polarizing, and even polemical answers to really complex problems. Parties like Hungary's Fidesz or Austria's FPO, they might not be overtly pro-Kremlin, but they vehemently reject all sanctions measures against Russia and military aid for Ukraine, often framing themselves as peacemakers. Now, that narrative, whatever the intent behind it, can seriously fragment European unity and weaken the collective response to those external threats we talked about.
The sources even mention Romania, described paradoxically as an anti-Putin, Putinist-like regime. What does that description tell us about the broader challenge here?
It really shows that supporting external values like backing Ukraine doesn't automatically mean you uphold democratic principles at home. Romania, despite its outward support for Ukraine, shows serious concerns about democracy. Internally, harassment of opposition deviating from European values, often for electoral gain. And this creates a kind of dangerous hypocrisy that can be exploited. It erodes internal trust and makes Europe vulnerable to critics pointing out inconsistencies in its own democratic house.
And finally, on this internal front, the digital battle for truth. We're living through this digital structural change where huge big tech companies and now generative AI are increasingly controlling how information flows, how it's even produced. How does this make Europe more vulnerable?
It's creating an environment where information gets hyper-personalized, potentially squeezing out quality journalism, and leaving Europe's public space extremely vulnerable, as one source puts it, to enemies of democracy. These adversaries can easily exploit these channels, spread misinformation, sow division, undermine democratic debate, often with very little effective oversight. It's a fundamental challenge to how we, as citizens, get and process information.
Okay, let's move to the economic dimension. Starting with Western sanctions on Russia, there seem to be two views out there. Some say Russia is weathering them okay, but our sources argue strongly for a wider systemic and lasting economic impact that will just increase over time. What's the picture emerging from the reports?
The reports definitely lean towards the long-term impact. While Russia has adapted in the short term, yes, the sustained economic pressure is expected to increasingly limit its ability to modernize, to develop. And the numbers certainly show Russia's absolute commitment to the war effort. Military spending projected to hit 6% of GDP in 2024, high forecast for 25-26 too. Putin's own finance minister has said publicly military financing is the top priority. This isn't just budgeting, it's effectively a declaration of endless war through finance, completely reorienting their economy.
Right. And alongside that, there's growing pressure to actually transfer frozen Russian state assets to Ukraine for its recovery. That includes the £2.5 billion from the Chelsea Football Club sale, still frozen in the UK bank account. What's the significance of this whole debate?
It's a huge debate, isn't it?
Right.
Both symbolically and practically. The UK is looking at new laws to potentially enable this transfer, and Estonia has already set up an alternative mechanism allowing compensation claims against Russia to be made against these frozen assets. It's really about finding a legal, ethical way to hold Russia accountable and get much-needed funds to Ukraine for recovery, for reconstruction. It's quite an innovative approach to accountability, really.
Now, on the flip side of finance, there are these concerns about golden passports and golden visas within EU member states.
Yeah.
Schemes letting individuals essentially buy their way into Europe. What's the main criticism there?
Well, they're heavily criticized for a lack of transparency, for eroding mutual trust within the EU, and frankly, for undermining core values. They create a loophole, don't they? One that can be exploited by cronies of authoritarian regimes, allowing them to embed themselves in European economies. And that potentially compromises security, letting illicit funds and influence seep into the bloc.
Okay, here's a really interesting counterintuitive point from the sources. A surprising potential Russian advantage. Climate change might actually offer Russia a relative advantage. How could that possibly be?
It is fascinating, if rather grim. The thinking is that rising temperatures could actually boost Russia's agricultural yields, increase its arable land, maybe make its vast northern regions more hospitable. Now, obviously, there will be huge costs too, like melting permafrost. But the report suggests the gains in other areas could potentially outweigh these losses. It might offer Russia an unexpected long-term economic benefit, even as other parts of the world really suffer from climate disruption.
So wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you, our listener? The sources we've looked at paint a very clear picture, don't they? Europe is at a crossroads. It's facing threats that are external aggressive, yes, but also internal, undermining its very foundations. And this situation, well, it demands a really robust, unified response.
Exactly. The imperative for action is loud and clear. The sources call for permanent European strength, a real roadmap for the future. What does that mean? Sustain military support for Ukraine, intensify economic pressure on Russia, and a relentless effort, absolutely relentless, to defend and strengthen democratic institutions from within. It's fundamentally about building resilience and, crucially, self-reliance, not dependence.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider. In a world where global stability feels increasingly fragile, where the lines between conventional war and hybrid war are just so blurred, how do we make sure that the joy of discovery, the free choice that our societies are built on, remain protected for the future, especially when the very tools we use for information, for connection, can be weaponized against us? What truly defines a nation's strength in this age of, well, interconnected vulnerabilities?